it's a very Catholic audience, tilted towards the back of the room, apparently. My name is Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and I welcome you to Rehm Library. The McFarland Center organizes programs to spark interdisciplinary dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. I can still vividly recall the day, early in January, about 20 years ago, when I encountered the front page of the Boston Globe, whose Spotlight team had begun to publish revelations of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy in Boston, based on incredible reporting and ultimately on court-ordered access to secret archival documents from the Archdiocese of Boston. There had been clergy sex abuse revelations before, including tragic cases in Louisiana and in Fall River, Massachusetts, those unearthed by Joe Bergatino of the Holy Cross class of 1973. But those were always successfully characterized by the Church as isolated incidents, not systemic problems. The Globe's case was radically different, and the paper documented the astounding and truly damning indifference of the Boston hierarchy to children and parents in the Archdiocese. They weren't outstanding to the many people who had lived through the pain, but they were revelatory to many other people, including me. Those revelations became a nationwide scandal, then a global crisis for the Roman Catholic Church. In the aftermath, the McFarland Center, as the newly established Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, hosted a conference, sponsored many other conversations, including one with Joe Bergatino, whom I mentioned, and Walter Robinson, who was the leader of the Spotlight team. But in recent years, I would say we failed to give as much deliberate attention to the issue as we might have, as it merits. Perhaps not surprisingly, as archives were unsealed in lawsuits in other dioceses over the years, and too often only when they were forcibly unsealed, we've been called to face up to failures on the part of the Church in the United States and also abroad. Unresolved questions about justice and care endure, even as significant steps have been made in many parts of the world. It's equally true that there have been genuine progress in advancing the protection of minors in the Church, and that there's plenty of room to improve to protect children who suffer unnecessarily and frightfully. I'm grateful to welcome Father Hans Zollner of the Society of Jesus to help us take stock of that history and the current status of abuse and prevention in the Church, how the Church has responded so far, and what still needs to be done. Father Zollner is a German Jesuit and a leading expert on safeguarding and the prevention of sexual abuse, working to address the issue worldwide. He founded the Center for Child Protection, now the Institute for Anthropology and Interdisciplinary Studies on Human Dignity and Care, or IADC, at the Pontifical Gregorian Institution in Rome, University in Rome. Since 2014, he's been a member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors and has been an advisor to the Congregation for Clergy. A psychologist and licensed psychotherapist, he's been a professor at the Institute of Psychology at the Gregorian since 2003 and has served as dean and academic vice rector. From 2010 to 2012, he was a member of the scientific working group of the Roundtable on Child Abuse, commissioned by the federal government of Germany. His talk today is one of the Deitchman Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity with support from the Rehm Family Fund. So thank you to them. And please join me in welcoming Hans Zollner.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. Thank you to Professor Landy for all the organization and for all the work that is behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you for all who have contributed to this event. It's 20 years that the Boston Globe has published the Spotlight Revelations, and it's a timely event also for the McFarland Center. I'm really happy that we have also people from the Gregorian University Foundation here who can bring our regards to Father McFarland, whom I'll meet elsewhere tomorrow and over the weekend. I want to share with you some reflections, and I hope that we can then start to enter also in a conversation on some of the perspectives that you can take when we reflect on sexual abuse committed by clergy within the Catholic Church, on issues of cover-up and the work of safeguarding, which is mainly my task in the Institute of Anthropology, as was said by Professor Landy. So my presentation follows these points: on the spot, the Church, clericalist attitude, perception of survivors, paradoxes, a way forward, with structural consequences, theological and pastoral principles, and spiritual lessons. The topic that we follow is justice and care with regard to the abuse cases and how they have been dealt with, how they have impacted us as a church, as faithful in different capacities and different roles we have, how it has impacted the image of the church, and how the relationship between the public, media, and the church has been changed. Justice and care. Now, this will be the motto for the following presentation. Justice and care, justice and mercy. A tension between the images of God that we have, the images of human beings, the expectations we have with regard to others, how they deal with us, and how we deal with others. The famous paintings, one by Rembrandt, the prodigal son comes home and is received by his father, and the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, the Last Judgment. So care and justice, mercy, and the law, the eternal law and the eternal fate that we have to face. Attention in human life, attention for Christians, and probably also for people from other religions. So we have to say that the Church has been on the spot, not only through Spotlight, but before that, there were the cases that came up in Newfoundland in the 1980s, in Canada, that were, so to speak, the first start of a public interest in sexual abuse committed by clergy. And for more or less 40 years now, the Catholic Church has been dealing with it, more or less successfully, I would say less successfully. And this is true for those areas in the world where sexual abuse has been a topic in media and in public attention that was given to it over the last 40 years. And this is maybe, to the best of my estimate, maybe 20, 25 countries in this world. So when people say this is a topic that is passé, I don't believe that. It is something that will stick around, if we talk about the global Catholic Church, for many years to come. And it has created shockwaves, as Professor Landy said. It has created the impression that the Catholic Church is not capable of dealing with the abuse, and its leadership is not only unwilling to take it on, but it is seriously obstructing also the elaboration of cases, the acceptance of victims, the betterment of policies, and the cooperation with civil authorities. My perspective is an international one. I know a little bit about the US, of course, because I follow news and I read papers and reports. However, all in all, over the last 40 years, it was not the case that the Catholic Church has cooperated willingly and openly and transparently with civil authorities all over the globe. The double crises, the crisis of the abuse itself, but when I came here about 5 years ago, and with the news about the former Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal McCarrick, and other cases, that brought to light that the leadership as such has really not done its job, that has set off a second crisis, the crisis of trust in leadership in the Church, which was confirmed also by the recent Munich study. 2 months ago, the Archdiocese of Munich published a report that they had commissioned, and the most devastating news of all this report, apart from the fact that there were hundreds of victims, of which we knew already from a first report in 2010, the most devastating news was when the lawyer who had conducted the investigation with her team was asked whether there was one of the archbishops since 1945, since the end of World War II, who had done what he was supposed to do in terms of listening to victims, dealing with cases, helping families and schools and parish communities that were divided and harmed. And she was thinking a bit, and then she said, not a single one. So out of 7 archbishops, liberals and conservatives, pastoral types and theologians, and not a single one had done what he was supposed to do according to canon law, according to civil law, and according to normal human and Christian behavior. And this is something that is really very disturbing to notice. You probably have heard about the numbers in France. The French Bishops' Conference had published a report in October with huge numbers of an estimate of possible victims by clergy and by lay employees in the Church from 1950 to 2020. Huge numbers that set about a discussion about the methodology in sociology, because there were sociological, statistical methods applied, which don't indicate that this is, yes, the exact number, but when you hear that over 70 years, the estimate of victims of clergy sexual abuse, victims, we talk about minors, the estimate was of 220,000 in France. You just get shocked and paralyzed. In Poland and in other parts of the world, like now in Italy, or recently also in Spain, those churches and bishops that always said that this is a Western problem, this is an American problem, this is an Anglo-Saxon problem or a Central European problem, and we don't have cases because we have lived a more spiritual life, and there were less occasions, like in Poland. During communism, we didn't have schools and so forth, so there would have been occasions to meet. In all these countries, it's crumbling down. They have to face reality, and victims come forward and speak about the abuse that they have suffered. So it is something that, unfortunately, we will have to face, and if we don't find another way to deal with it, the same will happen over and over again. The reputation, the image of the Church will suffer more and more, and the voice of theology and of pastoral initiatives of the Church will be silenced, simply because people don't believe in what the Church leaders say when they can accuse them of a double standard and double lives. So over the last years, there was much more focus on the abuse of adults, seminarians, and women. the McCarry case speaks volumes about what came up in the discussion about how seminarians are at risk in the seminaries. The Pope himself put the abuse of religious women on the agenda in one of his famous flight press conferences in 2019. He spoke about the abuse of religious women, consecrated women in some parts of the world. And the general impression, at least in our countries, is that they don't get it, the church leadership doesn't get it, and how could this happen and be covered up for so long? It's astonishing. There's nothing less than this. We can't understand how people who proclaim the gospel, who are excellent preachers, who talk about charity, didn't do the most simple and the most basic thing of Christian faith, protecting the most vulnerable ones. So, over time, bishops, cardinals, and the Pope himself have become the main target. The untouchables have now are in the focus. And for many years now, the Pope, who is in office since more than 9 years now, was spared of criticism at the general level. But more and more journalists now take also issue with him, since they think that he doesn't do what he could do to change the situation. The problem is the Catholic Church is the oldest, the biggest, and the most complex organization in this world, with 1.3 billion Catholics in 24 churches, in the different rites that we have within the Catholic Church, with 5,300 bishops, in 2,900 dioceses, with an unknown number of religious congregations and orders. And I could go on at length in explaining how difficult it is and how difficult it makes the situation if we have so many different layers of responsibility and authority, and that there is no unanimous position, not in one single bishops' conference, not in one single association of religious superiors in one country. We are so diverse. I will come back later to that. And the Vatican, the center of the Catholic Church, the leadership worldwide, is vastly understaffed. So for the task that they themselves have given themselves, and for what we expect the Holy See to do and the Vatican dicasteries to do, there is absolutely not the human resources to do that. Now, one of the main factors that have contributed to child sexual abuse is what generally is called clericalism. And the Pope has been very vocal about talking about clericalism and denouncing it. When it comes to the link between abuse and clericalism, I think it's important that we listen to some of the typical voices and the typical reactions that I get when I go around in the world. And this is very, very similar from one country to another, from one continent to another. So, first, the world simply doesn't understand us. I think there's something very deep in our attitude towards the world outside the church that doesn't help us to interact in an open and a transparent way. It is somehow, at least since the 1800s, so after the French Revolution and after what came about in Europe in the ages of the secularization, which meant that the ecclesial fiefdoms were abolished and the state took over all property and closed lots of monasteries and including the Society of Jesus, was suppressed. So in that age, the church has formed a sort of oppositional attitude towards the world, whereas it was the leading force for culture, for education, generally speaking, for 1800 years, or 1500 at least. At that time, there was a fundamental break. And I think this sits very deep in our attitudes. I represent Christ and his church, so I alone means I am Christ for you, and not we are Christ together. The media attacks are a sure sign that we are following the crucified. I can take whatever I wish. I have renounced to so much. My vocation is to serve. Of course, this is a very beautiful sentence, but of course it is also easily said, and it is very often linked to an attitude that betrays another behavior and another sort of thinking behind. I don't need anybody tell me what I should do, because I'm a priest, and therefore I know what I have to do, and I know also what you have to do. I don't need to justify myself. I'm accountable to God alone, and nobody shall criticize me. On the word accountable, I just want to show that this is something deeply entrenched in Catholic culture. When in 2019 we were preparing the so-called summit that Pope Francis had called for, of presidents of bishops' conferences and leaders of religious congregations, the three topics that the Pope wanted on the agenda were responsibility, accountability, and transparency. And when it came to translating the English word, because we had 4 official languages, English, Italian, French, and Spanish, when it came to translating accountability in the other 3, we found that there is no substantive, there is no noun that would translate one-to-one accountability in any of these languages. And you could add also Portuguese, and then you have the 4 major Catholic languages: Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese. And in none of them the word accountability exists as a noun that would translate to accountability or to the German equivalent. Now, if you don't have a word for something, what does that mean? You don't think about it, and you don't talk about it, and certainly you don't act accordingly. And if you live in Rome, as I do, since 22 years, you see that accountability is foreign to Italian culture, I would say, to the at least Roman culture. The northern Italians may have still some Austrian influence there, but the further south you come, the less accountability is as a concept could even be imagined. So this makes it very clear that within the Catholic culture, which is a Roman Catholic culture for most parts of the world, accountability is a word that is unknown. If we contrast to that the perception of survivors, of course, you see the divide. And it is very unfortunate that over the last 40 years, this divide has not been bridged in general. And it would have been the Catholic Church leaders who had the opportunity to reach out to victims of abuse, but they didn't do it. So very often the impression is that never ever has anybody listened to my story and to my hurt. I'm livid that they push away the responsibility. I don't know to whom I can turn for support. This is very often the impression. Now, I don't talk mainly about the US, but in other parts of the world, even if there is an office, very often people don't know where this office is, how it can be reached, whether the persons working there are trustworthy. If only I had not been so powerless. I had blind trust in Father X. I couldn't imagine that he could do anything evil. I've struggled long enough, I give up. You know that many survivors of abuse have attempted suicide and some have succeeded to take their own lives. I felt so dirty and guilty. You know, you have heard about the process, the psychological process that is behind the identification with the perpetrator, but also the identification with the guilt, because a holy man or a holy woman, like a religious sister who may have been abusive, cannot do anything evil. So if something evil has happened, I am responsible, I, the victim. If only they had the courage to confess their crimes and to do justice to us. I'm really astonished that we have so little capacity as a Catholic Church to do, as an institution, diocese, a province of a religious order, a school, a university, whatever, where abuse has happened, to undergo the same process that we require a person who comes to confession to go through. How do you prepare your confession? How do you conduct the confession? You do an examen of your conscience and you come to clarity about what went wrong. You repent. Then you go to confession and you confess clearly and you say what your sins have been. And then you do an act of reparation. And then we say, in this process, God's grace acts and allows for mercy and gives the absolution, or the fruit of the absolution, reconciliation with God and with my fellow beings. So why can't the Church apply that model to itself as an institution? Do the examine what went wrong, clearly, openly, seriously. Repent, honestly. Confess by naming my sins and my crimes, and then doing what can be done to repair the damage. So that would be something that would bring us also, with regard to the image of the confession, closer to reconsider what is the relationship between justice and mercy. So coming to this core, I would call it a paradox. The first paradox is justice versus mercy. And when you reflect on the possibility that we can receive mercy from a just God, you need to ask some questions. How can we assume that God and the Church can be so generous in their forgiveness, while at the same time never asking the victims of evil deeds for their consent? Is there a freedom not to forgive? The claim that ecclesiastical adjudication should serve justice and mercy simultaneously. How can humans perform acts that bind God? We say that in the process of the confession, mercy is administered and it comes about, but it comes about through the human channel. How can the individual be given credit in all these actions without neglecting the ecclesiological communal dimension? The history of the sacrament of confession is interesting because until the year 800, 900, there was only the public communal confession in the parishes, in the communities. And the hearing of the ear confession was an exercise of the monks, the Irish monks in the 8th and 9th and 10th century. And then it became a means of helping in the spiritual journey, basically spiritual direction. With regard to our question of abuse, how much has the individualization of sins and of responsibility versus forgetting the communal aspect, that my sin harm the church, contributed to hiding crimes and putting individuals aside, moving them from one place to another, and not taking sin seriously? How, without undermining justice, can the Church speak of forgiveness and reconciliation at all times and promise mercy in all its manifold fields of activity? We proclaim, and the Pope in 2015 had proclaimed the year of mercy. And if you read the document that inaugurated this year of mercy, you see that there is, yes, the accent on mercifulness and our hope that God is merciful to us and to our fellow human beings. But there is also the question, how then can we talk about justice? And of course, this is something that is necessary to consider if we talk about how we deal with perpetrators. So is there any room for punishment in a church of mercy, hope, and love? And I had recently a fallout with one of our major canon lawyers at the Clergy on the question of how do we bring perpetrators to accept the mercy that is offered, and what are the conditions about that? And in what way are victims of abuse involved in such a process? In every just action, there is also a dimension of mercy. Correspondingly, in every merciful action, there is a certain dimension of justice. But there is also a tension between justice and mercy that cannot be ignored, and that will last until the last day, the last judgment. In this world, on this earth, we will never solve the tension between justice and care, justice and mercy. There will always be the question, how can they be reconciled one to the other? So how can we conceive of God as merciful and just at the same time? And how can they be reconciled within God himself? Since we know that so few people go to confession nowadays, the question is modernity characterized by losing touch with God and sin? Or do we miss the point of where today the faithful and people outside the church look for forgiveness, look for dealing with the sense of guilt, even if it may be quite vague and obscure? But what do we offer so that people can understand their share in the responsibility with regard to the big questions that we have to face as humanity and the day-to-day questions in our lives, in our work? So justice versus care remains an open question, also for and in the church, because the church is not a black and white institution. It is a very mixed reality. We have in this church, at the same time, victims of abuse and perpetrators. From all what we can gather, most victims of clerical sexual abuse have not left the church. They are in the church. Most of them have never spoken about the abuse that they have suffered. And they stay on. Because perhaps they have that sense of need of belonging to a community because they feel that within this church they need to reach a level of reconciliation that no other institution could offer. In any case, from whatever we can gather, and if you take the big numbers, the estimate that I have been speaking about in France, we realize that there may be many, many more victims of abuse that still are in our congregations. The same is true for those who prosecute, who are severe, who report abuse, and those who cover up. And I'm sorry to say, but I surely believe that in some parts of the world, this is still what is going on. That still superiors, bishops, cover up, move people around, don't cooperate with society and justice. And then we have in the church those who work for safeguarding and those who downplay it, and those who say that we should finally finish with this. It's passé, it's done. Why do you still talk about this? We have to face this mixed reality within the church. We proclaim one church in the creed, but from all what I can say, at least in regard to our topic, the church doesn't function like a big company that has one policy. To the contrary, we have very little passing on of expertise and experience from one country to another, from one bishop's conference to another. Otherwise, you couldn't explain why the Canadians went through this and the Americans came 15 years later, and the Irish again 5 years later, and then the Australians, and then the Germans in 2010. The Italians are now grappling. The Spanish have just, together with the Portuguese, started an independent commission for the investigation into abuse. Now, 2022. And we don't talk about Africa, we don't talk about Asia, and we don't talk even about Latin America, where such reports like you have had for the US Bishops' Conference and the John Jay reports, or the yearly Caro report that assesses the situation in the diocese in this country. Don't talk about this, something similar like that in Brazil, for example, which is still the largest Catholic population in the world. So I'm really worried about what is going to come from all those countries if we continue in the same way. Just a word of caution: clericalism is well represented and present among clerics, but it is also present among non-clerics. This is something I learned in Australia when I was giving a talk to school directors in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, basically all women, lay women. And when I went through all the characteristics of clericalism, at the end they said, this applies also to us, when somebody holds a position, when prestige is more important than personality and competency, how we get our new personnel, how we select it. Is it because there is some pipeline that prepares people, or is it on the merits and so forth? So this is not something that would divide clergy and non-clergy. Then another paradox. Within the church, we have authoritarian structures, and we have certainly an insistence on the roles and the ministries, as we call it. But at the same time, power is very vague, and it is not concrete many times, at least not as a concrete order or a concrete command by somebody who would be in charge, like you would imagine that military works. Within the Catholic Church, there is surprisingly much diversity, so much that you would say that it is not a monolithic block. Many people think it's a pyramid of power. The Pope says something, the cardinals and the bishops do what he wants, and the priests fulfill what the bishops say. Now, look in the Catholic Church, cardinals criticizing publicly the Pope, bishops fighting with each other, parish priests not doing what the bishops ask them to do. So, to the contrary to what is generally perceived within the Catholic Church, we see that there is much more diversity, which contributes also to the cover-up of abuse. Because if you don't know who exactly is responsible for what, it is very easy to slip through and to avoid taking on your own share in responsibility. You can always point the finger to others. This was presented as one of the major discoveries in the report in the Netherlands by Deitchman that was published already in 2010. So what could be a way forward in holding together these paradoxes, these polarities? Holding together against splitting. So justice and care and mercy cannot be dissolved, and the tension cannot be dissolved. That will continue. And the question for us as a community, not only those who are in authority roles, will be that you don't try to favor one at the expense of the other. It is necessary that there is the feeling and the perception of there is an ongoing tension there. And we need to live with that tension, which makes life difficult, because if you had only justice or only mercy, then on the surface it would appear that it is easy to live. However, it would do injustice to one or the other if we kept it apart and if we followed only one path. Norms and attitudes. We have seen over the last 12 years a number of steps within canon law, within the law of the Church, that made it more severe and more clear to a certain extent of when it comes to the dealing with cases of abuse, as well as the accountability of bishops. So norms and laws are necessary. However, there is also a danger in thinking that by introducing policies and guidelines and laws, you can tick off the task. You have completed what you were supposed to do, and now you can go on and don't think about it anymore. As long as safeguarding doesn't become part and parcel of our understanding, our self-understanding as Christian, and if it doesn't really motivate us to continue reaching out to victims, then we will continue to make the same mistakes, because policy as such does not take away the possibility of going against that policy. That comes only out of an integrated, intrinsic motivation. That's also why we need to talk about changes in law, but also corresponding changes in theology. For example, with regard to who administers justice and mercy, the image of priesthood, the theology of bishophood. Where are we in this? I think there are major questions that the abuse crises have brought forward. Clergy and laity. There is a tendency in your country, in my country, that lay people try to take into their own hands the tension between justice and mercy, and sidelining bishops. Of course, that won't work within the structure of the Catholic Church as we have it. Therefore, how can we work together, and how can there be a new sense of working and thinking and praying together? I think one of the hallmarks of what I perceive in our church is a very segregated world in itself from one quarter to another. Bishops among themselves, lay people promoting another church in itself, religious congregations in itself, institutions in itself. So why is this so? I don't know. I think modern society, with all the social media contact that we have, doesn't really promote a deeper understanding and a deeper listening. However, if we want to stay together as a Catholic Church, this is something that we need to promote better than we do it now. Also, between dioceses and religious orders. In most places in this world, the bishops go one way with regard to dealing with cases of abuse, and the religious congregations another way. And very, very rarely there is a common understanding and a common procedure, which again translates then in the public as they are divided, there are the good guys and the bad guys, and why can't you have one approach together? And this is what I mean as a new asceticism. I believe that the old asceticism with certain spiritual or liturgical practices is gone, and it is good that it is gone because it had become an external exercise only. However, I don't see much that has replaced those old practices. So how can we promote really community within religious communities, within the presbyterate of a diocese, within the institutions of a certain region, within the diocese itself, among the dioceses, and within the communities in the parishes? I see that there is very often a longing for community, a longing for bringing people together, but there is very little capability or willingness to reach out to those from the other side, with whom I don't agree on very important thing or minor things, but there is a difficulty for us, I believe, to really come together and to really sustain a dialogue that goes beyond our own expectations and aspirations. Now, what could motivate us to do so? I think something that St. Ignatius has put in the third week of the exercises, that we suffer with him in the suffering of the marginalized, of the voiceless, because he himself has taken on this identification. He lives it out in his flesh, and he goes that way till he dies on the cross. So I find there is much talk about policy, there is much talk about legal issues in regard to abuse cases and cover-up. There is much attention to structural, systemic, institutional aspects. All right. But if we don't come to the level of also motivating or finding the roots of our motivation in relating all what we go through, all our questions, to Jesus himself, we will fall short of what we are supposed to do. Especially when it comes to confronting the uncomfortable issues. And there is a lot within our own Catholic mentality and reality. For example, the uncomfortableness with our own sexuality and the teaching of the Church on sexuality. The role of clergy that has to be clarified. And what you can find in quite a number of people, and which corresponds to what I said before about the distance to the Church, a sort of siege mentality. We build our own fortress, and we live in our fortress, and we try to keep the enemies outside there. So let us feel comfortable, cozy within our own relationships, within our own language, within our own thinking and reasoning. As long as this continues, we won't really cope with the abuse crisis, because we can't understand how much people are touched or scandalized by what they see in the management of the church with regard to those cases, as long as it was happening only within itself. I'd like to quote also somebody who was 2 months ago, who was very much in the news, Joseph Ratzinger, the theologian Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus, Pope Benedict. When we say that soteriologically we proclaim that the redemption comes through Christ to us, what does that redemption mean to us and for us? Ratzinger said that the content of Christian salvation is first the salvation from sin. Second, receiving a new existence, sharing in the foreexistence of Jesus. Remember the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, the hymn where it says that Jesus has given his life for us and has allowed us to live a life for others. The third, in the resurrection from the dead. Now, this has been brought to my attention by a Jesuit who has also a story with Holy Cross here. As Jesus exists for, as he represents, so do we come to exist for and to represent with him. So could it be that justice and care, justice and mercy come together in us, and the tension that will remain signs us and helps us to continue the search for something more than we can understand, something more that we can deliver, something more that we can supply by money, by legal advice, even by all our structures? Is there something that goes beyond our imagination? Because we try to be people for others, as Jesus has been in his existence for us. So coming to a closure, again with this image, what can we do, each one here, so that care and justice are brought about in that sense, not as something that solves once and for all everything, that heals the wounds of victims and survivors, of their friends and families, of their institutions, but that can help us to continue a journey that doesn't finish today or tomorrow, but gives us another sense of living and another sense of our mission as a church, in which all people, especially those who are most vulnerable, can feel and be safe. Thank you.
Hans, thank you so much for that very deep meditation on a lot of themes. The deep listening and respect for each other that you spoke of, it seems that the current process of the synodal way and synodal process has great hopes. Now, many dioceses in the United States have chosen not to engage in the synodal process, which is deeply disturbing. But could you say a little bit more about how your office and your work, have you been in touch with Sister Natalie Beckwart and the office on the Synod in Rome? And what hopes you see for this issue area with the synodal process, which people have said it's the largest listening session in global history, if we can pull this off, really deeply listening to each other.
Yeah, thank you. Matter of fact, I had invited Sister Natalie Beckwart, who is the Undersecretary in the Secretariat for the Synod, to deliver the keynote at the final event of our last diploma graduation of our students in the diploma in safeguarding, in which she fleshed out something that, from her understanding, how the synodal process is linked to safeguarding and vice versa. I believe, of course, that listening and the deep listening helps a lot, so that you realize that there is another person that needs help, support, that may have been wounded, that needs attention and needs also some kind of guidance, perhaps, because he or she is not capable of finding now a way out of that. I think there's another aspect in this that is very helpful if it is really implemented, and that is precisely what I tried to highlight, that this is a common exercise. I perceive that we have become a very individualistic believers, and there's very little communal understanding of what brings us together as Catholics in this congregation, in this charity, in this whatever. I think the abuse crises have shown that over time many of our personal histories, convictions, our institutional processes have lost the center, the focus. I feel something like the center is lacking. Why do we continue to do what we have done? Simply because we don't know better, simply because we are attached to that, because it's a custom, has become a custom, a tradition, or whatever, or because we really we realize what is binding this back to the source, to the center of our faith, Jesus and the gospel. This has clearly been lost when we come to the abuse allegations and the cover-up. It was simply absent. And there's another thing which I can't prove, but my intuition is that the presence of survivors of clergy sexual abuse in our midst, and which is much more prominent than we think and want to believe, with their traumatic experiences present in our midst, but not acknowledged, because they have not been listened to, not only by the bishops or the provincials, but the faith community as such doesn't like this. My intuition is the presence of that trauma has somehow promoted a segregation of some existential parts of our belief, of our faith, which is not connected to suffering. And if we as Christians believe that by the suffering of Christ, whatever that was, we have been, and his death, we have been redeemed and will rise with him. If we detach ourselves from the suffering part, how can we come to the resurrection? So, are we really prepared as Christians to go through the third week of the exercises to the fourth one? I believe there is much resistance to that. Yeah, this is what I would say. If it is a real listening process, and if it is a communal listening process, but in Germany, you may read news about that. At the moment, it goes quite well because there is so much of expectation and sort of pressure also from the public and media, and they want wonderful things there, miraculous things. But at least it seems, I'm not involved in that, but it seems that they are, to a great deal, they are listening to each other. And this is already something that the bishops, we have 27 ordinary bishops sitting there and auxiliary bishops, that at least they have to sit together in discussions, and they need to listen to voices from lay people and from different quarters, etc. At least they need to sustain that, because otherwise we shut down the dialogue. We don't even listen, but we cannot sustain a fruitful dialogue either. And if I look into the situation in this country from outside, from what I gather in the polarization also in the church, it doesn't seem, as if they are really, there's much of a bridge there. And I think it is necessary to build that bridge, and hopefully the synodal path could be such a bridge.
About 5 years ago, when I first heard of the Center for Child Protection, typical American response: this is great, this is really going to help solve a lot of things. And you quickly told me, no, it's not a solution. It's you talked about a way forward. And I think some here would like to know a little bit more about the CCP and how it came to the IEDC.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Tisha. So in 2010, I was in Ukraine at the Catholic University in Lviv, 29th of January, and I came to the Jesuits' house in Lviv, opened my computer and watched the news, and it said, Jesuit school in Berlin, cases of sexual abuse committed by members of the community. And I thought the same would happen as I had seen over 2002 Spotlight, when I had started following international news about that. For the German-speaking countries, for 8 years, it was like one case of the abuse committed by a priest was in the news for 2 days, then dropped, and 2 months, 3 months later, another news, but in between nothing. And so it went for 8 years. And when I saw that news, I thought the same will happen again. What wasn't the case, because it grew and grew and grew, and first to other religious communities, then the diocese, and then all institutions in the Catholic Church. In brackets, there were also then other institutions, non-Catholic, that came into the focus, but mainly attention was and still is mainly on the Catholic Church. So I got interested in that, and I tried to write some clarification papers in some journal in Italy, because in the Italian world this was unheard of. Yeah. So and then three things happened at the same time. The General Curia, our headquarter, the Jesuits' headquarter, called on the Gregorian University to organize something, some conference on this matter, because there were American Jesuits behind that, because they knew the situation in the Anglo-Saxon world, and they thought, let us do and offer something. And I was charged with organizing a conference, which then was held in 2012, basically a forerunner for what you have seen in 2019, but at the Greg, not at the Holy See. Secondly, I was appointed to what Professor Landi had said, to the scientific working group of the federal government in Germany on these matters, and I came to know the who is who of within the German-speaking countries, psychiatrists, forensic psychologists, pedagogues who had been dealing with sexual abuse against minors for many years, not with specific attention to the church, but anyway, experts. And thirdly, in that one of those meetings, I came to know a child psychiatrist from a state university in Germany who was setting up on behalf of the research ministry a blended learning program for the formation, education of medical personnel and teachers in the state institutions in Germany on safeguarding minors. And I approached him and I approached the minister, who was at that time a Catholic theologian, and later she became the ambassador of Germany to the Holy See, best friends with Angela Merkel, whether we could use that program for our purposes. And they agreed. So in a joint venture between this state university, the Archdiocese of Munich, and the Gregorian University, we established a consortium to find out whether we could apply that and offer that program to academic institutions of the Catholic Church worldwide. And in a 3 years pilot phase, we disseminated that to 11 institutions in 8 countries in 4 languages, and we evaluated that, and okay, it showed that it is useful. And through that 3 years pilot phase, we decided that we would continue the work. But the pilot phase was connected to the establishment of a Center for Child Protection at the Gregorian University. So that came about a month before we had the conference I was speaking about on 1st of January 2012. And then for 7 years it was inside the Institute of Psychology. I was the dean of the psychology, and at that time nobody thought about other questions than psychology and law, basically canon law and civil law. And only of late, the considerations of the systemic, institutional, sociological, and more also theological questions came up in regard to the abuse crisis. 1, and 2, we realized also that the blended learning is something that we can offer to institutions worldwide, academic institutions. We don't offer it to individuals. Blended, you know what blended means. We offer online units from our side that can be used for a course or a program in any institution, and need to be complemented by something on site, in the class, in a group setting, not least because we can't allow that people go into that program. Many get triggered then for one reason or another. Many find themselves deeply disturbed, and they need some support system next to them. And then another consideration was that we wanted to have our own on-site programs. So from 2015 on, we started to offer a 1 semester, what we call diploma course, certificate course, in safeguarding, in English, and that has become also a Spanish version. So at this moment we have an English and a Spanish version for the diploma course, certificate course, 1 semester. Then a few years later we realized that you can go always deeper, so we came to ask the Congregation for Catholic Education whether we could establish a master's program. So we have now a 2 years full academic full-time second cycle degree program for safeguarding, and we have a number of doctoral students. Plus, we give lots of conferences and workshops in Rome and elsewhere. And we are setting up now satellites in different parts of the world. For example, the Jesuit University in Lima, the Catholic University in Lviv, with whom we made recently a memorandum of understanding. We work with the Catholic University in Zagreb. So there are different places in the world where we see that there is openness and there is also the means and the resources to establish something sustainable. So this is our work. Why we became an Institute of Anthropology, interdisciplinary studies on human dignity and care from a Center for Child Protection. One, institution-wise, we needed to grow, and a center within our structure at the Gregorian University doesn't have its own faculty and can't confer degrees. And we wanted to confer degrees and we wanted to grow our own faculty. And then, why did we move from child protection to something wider? Because of some of the factors that I have mentioned here. We don't talk about abuse of minors only anymore. We need to talk about the abuse of adults, persons at risk. Some call it vulnerable persons, adults, whatever you wish. It is a very difficult area to define, but we cannot stick only to safeguarding minors, because we know by now, by many testimonies, that there are many adults who have been abused within the church in a spiritual way, abuse of conscience, abuse of power generally, sexual abuse also as adults, abuse of seminarians, abuse of consecrated women. So, but we know that this topic is so ugly, so uncomfortable, that nobody really wants to engage with it. You don't talk about it over tea, right? So how can we get out of a natural resistance and reluctance to take it on, which is normal? Because sexual violence is against vulnerable people, against children who are the most vulnerable, is perhaps the most repulsive thing you can think of. And certainly you don't want to talk about it. And this is also part of our difficulty as a church to take it on. But also society doesn't want to talk about it. So we thought we should try to highlight not only, or not in the first place, the abuse, but what we try to provide, what we try to make better. So, human dignity and care. And this is the reason why we hope that it gives also a different perspective of hope to people in the church, because when you talk only about abuse and what is not going well, of course you lose hope. You can't sustain something where you don't see any progress, over time at least. So when we engage in a discourse on human dignity and on care, we try also to help people to find it more helpful and more, let me say, resourceful, so that we don't get drained too much and don't get too much focused only on the dark side. Because there are many people who really want to change the situation. There are many good people, including bishops, who listen to victims. The problem is that we don't get to a level of quantity that really translates also in our own self-perception and the perception of the church by outsiders, that something has changed. We are not yet at this point. I'm hopeful, because I see, of course, many people who are really very highly engaged and committed in this, but still there is so much to do, and as long as we don't get to that level, we will struggle.
Maybe I'll ask one more question unless I'm chasing anyone away, but I like the paradigm of mercy and justice and care together, not you put in a different order. Can you concretize that a little bit? There are certainly people in America who would say, well, this all belongs maybe in the legal system, but how concretely do you put those together? Because it sounds good to do it, but I'm thinking about an example.
Yeah, I mean, so to whom do we apply that? Mercy, justice, care. Victims of abuse, perpetrators, leaders in the church, communities. You can really spell it out. I mean, we don't have the time to do it in great detail, but when it comes to victims, what does mercy mean for victims? Mercy towards themselves. How have they have been received by clergy, by their own parents, by the superiors, the bishops, the provincials? Did they really receive mercy, or did they receive a legal or legalistic response, which in this country, I understand, is particularly prominent because in this country you have a certain culture of litigation, and you have a certain culture of the prominence of legal aspects and the fear of huge reparation demands. In other parts of the world that is not the case, because you have another legal system and you don't have that necessity to really gauge every single step that you do as a superior in regard to victims. However, in some of those or most of those countries, the approach was not very different. So mercy towards victims in so far as they receive what they define as mercy and what they demand in terms of attention, in terms of support, in terms of reparation. Secondly, care. How do we care for victims over time? Is it done when you have listened once, but the person wants to continue a journey? I'm in contact with many victims from different places, and it can be really draining, it can be unnerving, because sometimes some victims write emails or call more than once a day. And they expect that you reply, because once you don't reply for 2 days, it triggers in them, at least in some of them, the same type of reaction that they have had when they stood in front of a bishop's house and knocked at the door, and the door was slammed in their face. So, care also in the sense of what, for example, something that within the church we have neglected and in theology has been neglected terribly. That is the theological dimension and the spiritual dimension. This is the reason why in our institute now we have a research project on the experience of victims of abuse on the spiritual side when they were abused. Many victims, most victims within the Catholic Church were very close to faith, were very close to church, were very close to the priests. The faith was very important for them. And prayer and practice and whatever was very important for them. Now, in the moment the abuse happens, what happens with their faith? As I said, I believe a good number of victims still consider themselves members of the church, go to liturgy, pray, believe in God. A good number can't do that anymore. So we want to find out what is the proportion there, and what are the spiritual experiences of victims, spiritual experiences, or how did it affect the spiritual side of their life, how they would describe it today, what happened to them when they were minors. Plus, the question now, at this point in their life, what do they expect the church to do so that this approaches their and takes up their needs today in regard to spiritual proposals. Whether they believe in God, whether they believe in Christ, whether they are members of the church or not. Because spirituality, as you know, can also be understood in different ways. How do they understand their spiritual side, and what do they think the church could and should offer so that this side is taken care of? And justice. Thirdly, justice. Many victims demand justice from the civil or penal court of the state and in the ecclesiastical forum. And many think that justice arrives even 40 years later, so that their suffering, the harm that has been done to them is vindicated. And very often they are deeply disappointed by both systems, because the state, in many places there is statute of limitation. After 20 years or 30 years you can't do anything anymore in any legal proceeding. The church can change that. There is a statute of limitation also for the church, but in principle the church can also lift the statute of limitation in serious cases, and it does lift that. But I'm accompanying now a person who goes through legal proceedings and canonical proceedings in the Anglican Church. She was abused by an Anglican priest, and she's terribly destroyed because she has to give account in detail what has happened to her, when it happened, and what were the circumstances, etc. So she goes back into the traumatic experience, and by talking about it again, of course, she is re-traumatized. But how can you then promote a victim-sensitive approach in the juridical system? How can you interrogate a victim and a perpetrator so that the victim is, let me say, is the least triggered possible and the most protected possible? How can you confront a perpetrator who is just denying and knows, as long as he denies, there is no proof, because sexual abuse by definition is something that happens in the hidden space and there are no witnesses present. So if he denies, there will never be that type of justice that a victim has longed for. So this is one of the most devastating experiences for victims, because that creates, of course, a sense of being abused again. And there is no way out of that. So now coming to the perpetrator, the justice there. How can we deal with people of whom we know or we can assume that they have abused, but they deny, and we have no proof whatsoever? How do you come to a conclusion in that? Now, within the church, because if this happens in the state tribunal, they can't do anything with this anymore. If you have a good number of indications that this perpetrator had abused a number of victims within the church setting, then you have a certain probability that this is true, and you can, this is at least what I hear, you can then confront the perpetrator, and you can say, even if you don't have a convincing proof of that, we assume that you are a perpetrator, and you have committed these and these crimes, also in the canonical forum. The justice and mercy piece here is, and this was my dispute with my colleague in Rome recently. Yes, we need, the church is supposed to say that the last word of God will be mercifulness and accepting who you are, whoever you have been and whatever you have done. And I would add, as long as you have gone through the process that I have described before, as long as you have also taken your share in the responsibility and you have paid for it. And this is something that unfortunately in a good number of priests, clergy who have abused is not present. They are not willing to pay their price. They are denying that they have abused. They consider themselves victims of something unjust that was unleashed against them because there was, unjustified, or if there was a relationship, it did not start with them because they were seduced and whatever. However, the question is, how do we care for perpetrators? Not only because we have a human call to care for everybody, but also because the care for perpetrators is instrumental for avoiding further abuse. And this is something very, very difficult to convey to the public. Because when we take care of perpetrators within the church and don't take care as much as necessary for victims, then you can say, look, even now, even after we know that this person is a perpetrator, they take care more of them and not of the victims. However, it is important to understand that half of perpetrators in church and outside relapse even after prison, even after therapy, and they abuse again. So one of the challenges is to convince also the public to say, if we take care of the perpetrator, this is also a measure for safeguarding. Because you have a safety plan, this is what I would recommend or expect that is taken into account. You have a safety plan for this perpetrator who needs to report every week or whenever, about every half an hour of the week, with whom has he been, what did he do, etc. And in the end, the question is mercy for perpetrators. This is very, very difficult for us in our human logic. How can we think that a murderer or a child molester receives mercy and absolution? In our human logic, that's not so easy, especially if you try to stand with the victims. However, as Christians, we cannot exclude that. So, but again, I would link that to the question of, has this perpetrator really gone through a conversion process and a repentance and a confession and a reparation? Has he contributed in this? This is against the concept what Bonhoeffer called of cheap grace. You cannot only wash your hands and say it's over because now I'm another person. No, this is a very demanding process. So these would be some of the concretizations.
Thank you for all of this. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for your presence and questions.